Hi folks, welcome back to the Tabletop's Edge and our continuing tutorial series on World in Flames, a Collector's Edition. Today we hit the high seas as we start to talk about the rules that cover naval warfare in the game. And specifically, today we're going to look at how naval movement works as well as naval transport. And as an add-on to the naval transport, we'll also cover the amphibious assault rules. Even though amphibious assault is a form of land attack, it just feels like the naval transport section makes a little more sense to talk about it. So with that being said, let's get started and take a look at how we get our navies moving on the maps. Now, if you'll recall from the episode where we talked about the naval counters themselves, naval units have two factors on them related to their movement: speed and range. And on the counter, the top orange circle is the ship's speed and the bottom yellow circle is the range. Range is going to determine how far a ship can move, while speed will determine how effective it is when it gets there. And you'll see what I mean in just a moment. Unlike land units and air units that move across the map hex by hex or hex dot by hex dot, naval movement is much more abstract, and ships are going to move through these sea zones. They're going to move sea zone by sea zone. Each sea zone has a series of 5 boxes in them called sea boxes, and they're located right above the name of the particular sea zone. A naval move has several different definitions, but we're going to stick with the basic one here where we're talking about moving a single ship counter, and we'll show how that moves. The ship is going to start out in a port. In this case, we have Pearl Harbor here over in the Hawaiian Islands. The ship in question is the Portland that I just showed you, with a range of 5 and a speed of 6. Now, you simply count each sea zone that the ship moves into as taking up 1 range and 1 speed. So to enter the Christmas Island sea zone here would cost 1, into the Marshalls is 2, and then up to the Central Pacific would be 3. Now, once the ship reaches the sea zone that it's going to be its final destination, the ship will spend the rest of the impulse, actually the rest of the turn, patrolling that particular sea zone. So it will need to enter one of the 5 sea boxes here. You determine which box the ship is eligible to enter by subtracting the number of sea areas that it has moved so far from its speed, and then it is eligible to enter any box that is equal to the remaining speed points or less. So in our example, the Portland here has spent 3 range points and 3 speed points to enter the Central Pacific Ocean, which means it would be eligible to enter the 3 box, the 2 box, the 1 box, or the 0 box. The higher the box, the more effective the ship will be, in that it will have a greater likelihood of finding enemy units when it searches. And we'll get to searching and naval combat in our next episode. Now, if the Portland did not take such a roundabout path to get there, if instead it had sailed there directly from Pearl Harbor by going into the Hawaiian Islands sea zone for 1 and the Central Pacific for 2, it would then have 4 speed points remaining, allowing it to enter the highest box here. Now, once the ship enters that sea box in whatever destination sea zone it's in, it's going to remain there for the duration of the turn. Not just the impulse, but the entire turn. The only way it will leave that particular sea box is if, in a later impulse, it uses a naval move to slide into a lower box in that sea zone, or if it's aborted by combat, or if you choose to voluntarily abort the ship and return it to a port. So the big things to remember about naval moves are that they will most often begin in a port. You can move directly to another port. I could enter the Hawaiian Islands for 1 and then enter the port at Midway for 2, and that would be 2 range as well as 2 speed. You always pay 1 point of both to move into a sea zone or into a port. You always have to pay for the first sea zone that your port is adjacent to. And as you can see here with Pearl Harbor, because the border of the sea zone touches the port symbol, it means that the port is adjacent to both the Hawaiian Islands and the Christmas Island sea zone. So you'll notice then that some ports on the maps are a lot more valuable than others because they are adjacent to more sea zones, meaning that the ships based in that port are closer to a lot more of the sea areas than they would be in other ports. And an excellent example of that is found here in the Pacific with the Japanese port of Truk in the Caroline Islands. You can see there are a total of 1, 2, 3 different sea zones all adjacent to this port. So the Japanese ships that are based here can spend one range point and move point to enter the Bismarck Sea, or one to enter the Solomons, or one to enter the Marianas. Understanding where those key ports are and being able to capture them, garrison them, hold on to them, and base your fleets there will make your fleets a lot more effective than other ports. And that's a big part of the naval game, not just in the Pacific, but also in Europe as well. Now, let's take a look at the definition of what exactly a naval move is in a little more detail. WiFCE uses the term task force to denote any group of naval units that start the impulse stacked together and then move together and remain together for the duration of their move. Now, that could be a task force of one single ship, or it could be a task force of this entire stack of the U.S. fleet. As long as they begin together, remain stacked together as they move, and end up in the same destination hex, whether that is another port or a section of a sea box in a sea zone. And it's important to remember that the destination is the particular section, not just the sea zone, but it's the section of the sea box. So if the U.S. fleet here, I could move all of these ships and make a gigantic mess into the three section of the sea box in the Bismarck Sea, and that would be considered a single naval move. However, if instead of placing them all in the three box, I moved out of Rabaul and I decided to place just one ship in the one box instead, that would be considered two naval moves, one for this destination and one for that destination. Now, naval moves for surface units have three definitions in World in Flames. First is what we've just seen. You start in any one port, you move the stack to a single destination, be it a specific section of the sea box or another port. The second definition of a naval move is if you move a group of naval units from one section of a sea box to a lower numbered section of the same sea box. That would be considered one naval move. And finally, a naval move is also considered when you take a face-up task force of ships and move them from a section in a sea box back to a port where they are usually turned face down. And in order for ships to move, like land units and air units, they must be face up. Now, it's important to remember that once a ship leaves a port and enters a particular section of a sea zone, you cannot move from one sea zone to another sea zone. You can only go from ports to sea zones or sea zones back to ports. So essentially what you're doing is you're committing whatever naval units you move into that sea zone. When they move, you're committing them to one particular sea zone, and that's where they're going to remain for the rest of the entire turn. Now, when they return to base, they don't always have to return to the port they came from. They could instead reach any port within their range and movement allowance. So it would be possible for this fleet to have started in Rabaul and then tried to rebase here to Manila, either at some point during the turn in one of the impulses where they spend a naval move to do so, or they can wait till the end of turn stage in the return to base phase where they could have that option. Now, it's possible for a task force that is moving through multiple sea zones that as it moves through sea zones, it can detach or drop off certain ships that would remain in that sea zone as it continues moving on to its final destination. Now, the ships that are dropped off or detached have to stop moving in that sea zone. They would then enter whichever section of the sea box they would have enough speed to be eligible for. And the original stack would continue moving on to its final destination. This would count again as 2 moves because we've got 2 different destinations. Now, why would you do something like this? Why would you bother moving and then dropping something off rather than just, moving them separately to begin with? Well, if the enemy has some naval units and a presence in the sea zone that you're moving through, and you've got a small force that you would like to deploy to one sea area and a larger force that you'd like to deploy to another, or maybe it's 2 smaller forces that are going to different sea zones, rather than have the enemy be able to potentially intercept each of your smaller forces as they move through, you could move them through in a combined stack, a combined task force, and then once they have moved through the sea zone, they could then drop the one task force off in this sea zone while the rest continue on to their destination in the other sea zone. So it gives you some protection. It's just an example of where the fact that you can drop units off as you go would come into play. Now, submarines move in exactly the same manner as surface ships, with the exception that you may move any number of submarines from any number of ports to any number of destinations for one naval move. What this does, I suspect it's kind of a play balancing issue, but it allows a country like Germany, which does not have a very high naval move limit on its impulse action types, to still pose a threat to the Allied powers in the Battle of the Atlantic by being able to deploy all of her U-boats with a single naval move, instead of having to detract too much from her land moves. If she's mired in the Soviet Union and has a massive land campaign going on, the last thing you want to do is be forced to lose an entire impulse by selecting a naval impulse. So instead you can do a combined impulse and get all of your U-boats and submarines out to sea to any number of destinations with that single move. And the last thing I want to say about naval moves regards neutral major powers. For neutral major powers, each naval move is counted as a single individual ship counter. So they may not move an entire stack or task force of units as a single move. This is going to impact, obviously, the United States early on and Italy prior to her entering the war. So for neutral powers, each naval unit moved counts as a separate naval unit, even if they begin together, remain stacked together, and end up at the same destination. Normally, you need to move from a port into the sea zone that the port is adjacent to. There are 3 exceptions on the maps to that, and we're looking at the first one here. This is Kiel. Kiel is a port on the Baltic Sea. However, any ships that are stationed in Kiel can move directly to the North Sea as their initial movement. They do not have to enter the Baltic Sea and then sail around Denmark here into the North Sea. So if you're in Kiel, you can go directly to the North Sea with your first range and movement point, or you can go directly into the Baltic Sea. The second location is Suez down in Egypt, and that works as a port right here. It is a port on the Red Sea sea zone. However, if you're in Suez, you can enter either the Red Sea or you can go directly to the Eastern Med. The third port like this is Panama, located over in Central America here. Panama is a major port that is located on the Gulf of Panama, but you can also move from Panama directly into the Caribbean Sea. There are several naval movement restrictions that you'll want to be aware of. Those can be found in section 11.4.4 on page 22 of the rulebook. Most of them concern the three canals that we looked at, the Kiel Canal, Suez Canal, and Panama Canal, but they also deal primarily with the entrance and exits to the Mediterranean here around Gibraltar, as well as Suez and through the Dardanelles into the Black Sea. So you want to make sure you check up on those. I won't go over those here with you since they're pretty self-explanatory. Again, just check page 22 of the rulebook. I know I said at the top of the video we'd be talking about naval movement and naval transport today. However, we're already pushing the maximum time limit I like to try to keep these tutorial videos to. So we're going to break it off right here with just the naval movement discussion today, and we'll pick it up with naval transport in the next episode. So I'll just wrap it up real quick with a little summary of the high points that you'll want to keep in mind with naval movement. First of all, ships move from sea zone to sea zone, and when they reach a particular sea zone, they will patrol that destination sea zone by entering one of the sections of the sea box in that zone. It costs naval units, when they move, it costs them 1 point of speed as well as 1 point of range for every sea zone or port that they enter. When they reach their final destination sea zone, you simply subtract the number of speed points that they've used to reach that sea zone, and that will tell you which which sections of the sea box it's eligible to enter. So in this case, the Mississippi, leaving Pearl Harbor, has moved 2 sea zones. It has used 2 range and 2 speed, leaving it 2 speed, which means it can enter the 2, the 1, or the 0 box in the Marshall's sea zone. What's really important to remember is that naval units can never move from one sea zone directly to another sea zone. So when you sortie them from your port out to a particular sea zone, you're basically committing them to that sea zone for the entire turn. They are going to remain there until the return to base phase in the end of turn stage. The only exceptions to that would be if they were damaged or boarded as a result of combat, or if you voluntarily decide to return them to base, at which point they would return and be turned face down. When returning to base, you need to subtract the number of the section of the sea box they're in from their speed. And then keep in mind that they're going to need a point of speed and a point of range for every sea zone and port they enter. So in this case, the Mississippi in the 2 box in the Marshalls only has 2 points of speed remaining, even though it has a range of 4, which means that it could not return to base over in Guam because Japan, for instance, because it would be 1 to move to the Marianas, it would be a 2nd to move to the Japanese coast, and it would be a 3rd speed point to enter the port. It has the range points. It's got 4 range points, but it does not have the speed. So it would be forced to return to Christmas Island and then to Pearl Harbor, or it could go to the Marianas and then to Guam for the 2nd point. That's pretty much the main things you want to keep in mind when you're moving your units about the map. Like I said, we'll pick up with naval transport next, and then we'll get into naval combat, both the surface, air, and the submarine combat. So thanks for watching today, and stay tuned for the next episode. Take care.